October 28, 1943. The USS Eldridge destroyer sits in Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Within minutes, witnesses claim the ship vanished into thin air, teleported 200 miles away, then reappeared, with crew members fused into the metal hull, driven insane, or simply gone. The U.S. Navy calls it fiction. Survivors whispered it was real. This is the story of the Philadelphia experiment, the most terrifying naval test in history, where the line between science and horror blurred forever. Before we dive into this nightmare, if you love mysterious military history and unexplained phenomena, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We're uncovering the darkest secrets of World War II, one story at a time. And drop a comment, do you think the Philadelphia experiment really happened? Now, let's begin. Chapter 1, The Shadow War of Science. The year is 1943, and World War II has become a conflict unlike any other in human history. But while soldiers battle across Europe and the Pacific, another war rages in secret, a war of science, technology, and desperate innovation. The Manhattan Project races toward the atomic bomb. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park crack Nazi communications. And in laboratories across America, scientists push the boundaries of physics itself. Among these classified projects, one stands apart in its ambition and mystery, the quest for invisibility. Not the fantasy invisibility of comic books, but something far more sophisticated, electromagnetic invisibility. The concept emerged from the brilliant mind of Albert Einstein himself, or so the story goes, through his unified field theory. The idea was revolutionary. If you could generate a powerful enough electromagnetic field around an object, you might bend light and radar waves around it, rendering it undetectable. For the U.S. Navy, this wasn't science fiction, it was the ultimate weapon. German U-boats were decimating Allied shipping convoys in the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was bleeding the Allies dry, with hundreds of ships sent to the bottom every month. If the Navy could make their vessels invisible to enemy radar and visual detection, they could turn the tide of the entire war. Victory would be assured. The Office of Naval Research allegedly greenlit what became known as Project Rainbow. The goal, to create a ship that could disappear. The location, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, already humming with wartime production and far from prying eyes. The vessel chosen for this experiment was the USS Eldridge, a cannon-class destroyer escort, hull number D-173. She was new, commissioned in August 1943, just months before the alleged experiment. At 306 feet long and displacing 1,240 tons, the Eldridge was small enough to be expendable but large enough to serve as a proper test platform. The scientific team behind Project Rainbow reportedly included some of the greatest minds of the era. Nikola Tesla, the eccentric genius who'd pioneered alternating current and wireless transmission, was rumored to be involved before his death in January 1943. Dr. John von Neumann, the mathematical prodigy who would later father modern computing, allegedly took over the project. And overseeing the theoretical framework was supposedly Einstein himself, though he was officially focused on the Manhattan Project at Princeton. These scientists weren't working in a vacuum. They were building on decades of electromagnetic research and recent breakthroughs in quantum mechanics. The theory was intoxicating: install massive electromagnetic generators on the ship, create a field powerful enough to bend electromagnetic radiation around the vessel, and achieve perfect invisibility. On paper, the math suggested it might work. But there was a problem that no one fully anticipated, or perhaps they did, and decided to proceed anyway. The electromagnetic fields required would be so powerful, so all-encompassing, that their effects on the human body were completely unknown. Would the crew be safe inside this bubble of bent spacetime? Would their biology withstand exposure to electromagnetic forces thousands of times stronger than anything humans had ever experienced? The Navy, desperate for any advantage in the war, apparently decided to find out. The Eldridge was fitted with experimental equipment, massive generators, coils of thick copper cable, and what witnesses described as strange antenna-like structures. The ship's normal crew was told nothing. They were simply ordered to prepare for a test. As October 1943 approached, tension filled the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. scientists made final calculations. Engineers ran diagnostics on equipment that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. And the crew of the USS Eldridge, mostly young men in their late teens and early 20s, waited unknowingly for an experiment that would allegedly change their lives, and their reality, forever. Chapter 2, The Experiment Begins. The morning of October 28, 1943, dawned gray and cold over Philadelphia. The USS Eldridge sat at Pier 4 in the naval shipyard, her hull dark against the murky waters of the Delaware River. Aboard the ship, approximately 181 officers and enlisted men went about their duties, unaware that they were about to become part of naval history, or legend. According to the most detailed accounts, the experiment was scheduled for mid-morning. The Eldridge's crew had been given minimal information, told only that they were participating in a classified degaussing test. Degaussing was a real and common procedure during World War II, using electromagnetic coils to neutralize a ship's magnetic signature and protect it from magnetic mines. The crew had no reason to suspect anything unusual. What they didn't know was that the equipment installed on their ship went far beyond standard degaussing gear. Witnesses from other vessels in the shipyard later claimed to have seen strange apparatus on the Eldridge, massive generators that seemed oversized for a destroyer escort, thick cables running along the deck in unusual configurations, and cylindrical objects mounted at key points along the hull. One observer described it as looking like the ship had been wrapped in a metal spiderweb. At approximately 9 o'clock hours, the order came down to clear all non-essential personnel from the dock area around the Eldridge. A security perimeter was established, unusual for what was supposedly a routine test. On the bridge, senior officers, perhaps including scientists in naval uniforms, made final preparations. Below decks, the massive generators began to warm up, filling the ship with a deep, resonant hum that crew members would later describe as feeling more than hearing, a vibration that seemed to penetrate bone. At 9:15, the generators reached full power. What happened next depends on who tells the story, but the most consistent accounts describe a phenomenon that defied explanation. A greenish fog began to materialize around the ship, starting at the waterline and rapidly spreading upward. It wasn't smoke or steam, witnesses said it had an eerie luminescence, almost like the aurora borealis had descended to sea level. The fog glowed with an otherworldly light, casting strange shadows across the dock. Inside the electromagnetic field, the crew of the Eldridge felt the change immediately. Several survivors later described a sensation of intense nausea and disorientation, as if gravity itself had become uncertain. The ship's metal structures began to emit a high-pitched whine. Loose objects started behaving strangely, compasses spinning wildly, metal tools vibrating, light bulbs flickering even though they weren't connected to power. Then, according to the most dramatic versions of the story, the impossible happened. The USS Eldridge began to disappear. Not all at once, but gradually, like a photograph fading in reverse. The hull became translucent, the superstructure ghostly. Witnesses on nearby ships reported being able to see clear through the Eldridge to the water on the other side. Some said only a faint outline remained, shimmering in the greenish fog like a mirage. Others claimed the ship vanished completely, leaving only a depression in the water where it had been floating. The invisibility lasted, again, according to legend, for several minutes. But invisibility was apparently not the only effect. Several witnesses, including a merchant mariner named Carlos Allende who later became the primary source for the Philadelphia experiment story, claimed something far more extraordinary occurred. The Eldridge didn't just disappear from Philadelphia. It teleported. Over 200 miles south, at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia, sailors aboard other vessels reportedly witnessed the impossible, a destroyer escort materializing out of thin air, remaining visible for several minutes, then vanishing again. The ship that appeared in Norfolk matched the description of the Eldridge perfectly. If true, the Navy hadn't just achieved invisibility, they'd accidentally created a teleportation device. Back in Philadelphia, when the generators were powered down, the greenish fog dissipated. The USS Eldridge slowly rematerialized at its dock, exactly where it had been before the experiment began. From the outside, the ship looked intact. But the silence from within was ominous. No crew members appeared on deck. No signals came from the bridge. When naval personnel finally boarded the Eldridge to check on the crew, they allegedly found a scene of absolute horror. And that's where our story takes its darkest turn. Chapter 3, The Nightmare Aboard. The boarding party that climbed aboard the USS Eldridge after the experiment ended was unprepared for what they found. According to accounts from alleged witnesses, what greeted them was a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, a nightmare written in flesh and metal that defied every law of nature and physics. The first thing they noticed was the silence. A naval vessel, even one at dock, is never truly quiet. There's always the sound of machinery, the murmur of voices, the routine clanging and movement of crew. But the Eldridge was dead silent, as if the ship itself were holding its breath. The boarding party called out. No one answered. As they moved deeper into the vessel, they began finding the crew, or what remained of them. The accounts vary in their horrific details, but certain elements appear consistently across multiple sources. Some crew members were found in a state of complete disorientation, standing in corridors or sitting at their stations, unresponsive to questions or commands. Their eyes were open but unfocused, as if they were staring at something no one else could see. When medical personnel tried to examine them, these men didn't react. They weren't unconscious, they were simply gone, their minds seemingly erased or transported somewhere their bodies couldn't follow. But the disoriented crew members weren't the worst discovery. Throughout the ship, the boarding party allegedly found crew members who had been physically altered by the experiment in ways that seemed to mock the laws of biology. The most horrific reports describe men who had been partially fused with the metal structure of the ship itself. One sailor was reportedly found with his hand embedded in a steel bulkhead, the flesh and metal merged at a molecular level, as if the electromagnetic field had somehow caused matter itself to become fluid and then re-solidify incorrectly. Another crew member was allegedly discovered with his body passing through the deck, his torso visible on one level while his legs protruded from the ceiling below. The metal hadn't been cut or damaged, it was as if the man and the ship had briefly occupied the same space, then solidified together. The sailor was still alive, conscious, screaming in agony. Medical personnel had no way to help him. How do you separate a man from a ship when they've been fused at an atomic level? Other crew members had simply vanished entirely. The ship's roster showed 181 men aboard when the experiment began. When the final count was made, only about 140 could be accounted for, in whatever state they were found. The others had disappeared completely, leaving behind no trace, not even their uniforms or dog tags. Had they been teleported somewhere and not returned? Had they been erased from existence? The Navy had no answers. Perhaps most disturbing were the crew members who initially seemed fine. In the hours and days following the experiment, several sailors who had appeared to survive unscathed began experiencing what witnesses called spontaneous invisibility. Without warning, these men would begin to fade from view, their bodies becoming translucent and then transparent. Some would reappear moments later. Others took hours. A few, according to the accounts, never came back. The phenomenon apparently occurred without any pattern or warning. A sailor could be eating lunch in the mess hall and suddenly begin to disappear, his screams of terror fading along with his physical form. Men became terrified to be alone, afraid they might vanish and be unable to find their way back to visibility. Some reportedly kept their hands pressed against walls or held tightly by shipmates, as if physical contact with solid matter could anchor them to reality. The psychological effects were equally devastating. Crew members who had retained their sanity during the experiment itself began to break down in the aftermath. Some developed what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, plagued by nightmares and flashbacks to the moment the ship had disappeared. Others became convinced they were still invisible, or that they were actually dead and experiencing some form of afterlife. Several allegedly attempted suicide, unable to live with what they had experienced. The Navy's response, according to the legend, was swift and brutal. The ship was immediately quarantined. The crew members who could be moved were transported to military medical facilities, particularly the Naval Hospital in Philadelphia. Those who had been physically fused with the ship presented a unique problem: they couldn't be moved, and their condition was beyond any medical intervention 1940s science could provide. The decision of what to do with them remains one of the darkest aspects of the entire story. Medical officers who examined the surviving crew reportedly found anomalies that had never been documented in medical literature. Some men had irregular heartbeats that defied conventional explanation, as if their cardiovascular systems had been rewired. Others showed signs of cellular degradation, their bodies aging rapidly. Blood tests revealed unusual isotope ratios, suggesting the men had been exposed to radiation or some other form of energy that altered their biology at a fundamental level. But perhaps the most chilling detail was what the survivors themselves reported about their experience during the experiment. Those who could speak coherently described a sensation of being pulled apart and put back together, of existing in multiple places simultaneously, of seeing colors that didn't exist and hearing sounds that had no source. Several claimed they had seen the future, the past, or alternate realities. One sailor allegedly drew complex mathematical equations on the walls of his hospital room before dying, equations that, decades later, would resemble theories in quantum physics that hadn't yet been developed. Chapter 4: The Cover-Up and the Witnesses. Within 24 hours of the experiment, the U.S. Navy's machine of secrecy kicked into overdrive. If the accounts are true, what happened aboard the USS Eldridge represented not just a failed experiment but a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions, one that could never be revealed to the public, the enemy, or perhaps most importantly, to the families of the crew members who had been killed or driven insane. The official response was swift and comprehensive. The USS Eldridge was immediately removed from Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. According to naval records, the ship departed Philadelphia on November 1, 1943, just days after the alleged experiment. She was sent on convoy escort duties to North Africa, getting her as far from Philadelphia as possible. The surviving crew members were reportedly scattered to different ships and bases across the Navy, ensuring they couldn't compare notes or build a coherent narrative of what had happened. The men who had been most severely affected, those driven insane, those experiencing spontaneous invisibility, those fused with the ship's structure, simply disappeared from official records. Families received telegrams informing them of deaths in action, accidents at sea, or medical discharges. The details were always vague. The bodies, when they were returned, were in sealed coffins with orders not to open them. Many families never received bodies at all. Military personnel who had witnessed the experiment or its aftermath were allegedly visited by naval intelligence officers. The conversations were polite but firm. What they had seen was classified at the highest levels of national security. Discussing it would be considered treason in wartime, punishable by court-martial or imprisonment. Most witnesses, being military personnel during wartime, understood the implications and remained silent. Some took the secret to their graves, never telling even their spouses or children. But not everyone stayed silent. And that's where the story of the Philadelphia experiment transitions from alleged historical event to enduring legend, thanks primarily to one man, Carlos Miguel Allende, who also went by the name Carl Allen. Allende was a merchant mariner who claimed to have been aboard the SS Andrew Furuseth, a Liberty ship that was allegedly docked near the USS Eldridge during the October 1943 experiment. In 1956, 13 years after the supposed event, Allende wrote a series of bizarre letters to Dr. Morris K. Jessup, an astronomer and UFO researcher who had published a book about unidentified flying objects and their propulsion systems. Allende's letters were extraordinary in their detail and disturbing in their implications. Written in a rambling style with unusual capitalization and spelling, the letters claimed that Jessup's theories about electromagnetic propulsion were not just theoretical, they had been tested by the Navy in 1943, with catastrophic results. Allende provided specific details about the USS Eldridge experiment, describing the greenish fog, the ship's disappearance, and the horrific fate of the crew. What made Allende's account particularly compelling was his inclusion of details that seemed too specific to be pure invention. He mentioned crew members by name, cited dates and locations, and described technical aspects of the experiment that weren't common knowledge. He claimed that some crew members had survived and been released from military service, though they were idiots, metaphysically speaking, driven insane by their experience. Allende also made an extraordinary claim. He said he had personally witnessed the experiment's results, seen the ship disappear and reappear, and later had contact with crew members who told him what had happened aboard the Eldridge during its disappearance. He described conversations in bars and restaurants where these traumatized sailors had shared their stories with him, always looking over their shoulders, always afraid of who might be listening. Dr. Jessup was intrigued but skeptical. He tried to contact Allende for more information and verification. Allende responded with more letters, providing additional details but always remaining just out of reach, never agreeing to meet in person or provide concrete evidence. The correspondence might have ended there, forgotten as the rantings of an eccentric, except for what happened next. In 1957, Jessup received a mysterious package from the Office of Naval Research. Inside was a paperback copy of his own book about UFOs, but this copy had been heavily annotated by unknown readers. The margins were filled with comments written in 3 different colored inks, suggesting 3 different authors. The annotations discussed alien civilizations, advanced propulsion technology, and intriguingly, referred to a naval experiment involving invisibility and teleportation. The Office of Naval Research claimed they had received the annotated book anonymously and were forwarding it to Jessup because it referenced his work. They seemed concerned about the contents and arranged a meeting with Jessup to discuss it. When Jessup examined the annotations, he immediately recognized the handwriting and writing style. It matched Carlos Allende's letters. This was the detail that transformed the Philadelphia experiment from a lone whistleblower's claim into something more substantial. Why would the Office of Naval Research, the very organization that would have overseen such an experiment, take an interest in an annotated book about UFOs? Why contact Jessup? The ONR's involvement suggested there might be more to the story than simple delusion or hoax. The ONR later stated they had received the book from a naval officer who was concerned about its contents and wanted to preserve it, nothing more. But the timing and circumstances seemed too coincidental. Researchers began to wonder, was the ONR trying to gauge how much Jessup knew? Were they attempting to control the narrative? Or was the annotated book itself a form of disclosure, a way for someone inside the Navy to hint at truths they couldn't openly speak? Tragically, Dr. Morris K. Jessup would never get to fully investigate these questions. In 1959, just 2 years after his meeting with the ONR about the annotated book, Jessup was found dead in his car in Dade County, Florida. The engine was running, a hose had been attached to the exhaust, and carbon monoxide had filled the vehicle. The death was ruled a suicide. Jessup had been depressed and struggling financially. But Jessup's friends and some researchers questioned the suicide ruling. Jessup had scheduled meetings for the following week and had spoken to associates about new leads in his research. Some suspected that Jessup had gotten too close to the truth about the Philadelphia experiment and had been silenced. Others believed his death was indeed self-inflicted but was driven by threats or pressure related to his investigation. The truth, like so much about the Philadelphia experiment, remains shrouded in mystery. Chapter 5: The Evidence and the Skeptics. In the decades since Carlos Allende's letters emerged, the Philadelphia experiment has become one of the most debated alleged incidents in military history. The story has been exhaustively investigated by researchers, journalists, and conspiracy theorists, while skeptics and the U.S. Navy have consistently denied it ever happened. The question remains, what evidence exists, and what does it actually prove? Let's start with what we can verify as historical fact. The USS Eldridge was a real ship, commissioned on August 27, 1943. Her official naval records show she was assigned to convoy escort duties in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, a dangerous but routine assignment for destroyer escorts during World War II. The ship's deck logs, which should document every significant event, show no gap or irregularity in October 1943. According to these logs, the Eldridge was not even in Philadelphia on October 28. She was in New York, preparing for her maiden voyage to the Caribbean. The Navy's official position has been consistent and unambiguous. In 1996, the Office of Naval Research released a statement, ONR has never conducted any investigations on invisibility, either in 1943 or at any other time. The alleged Philadelphia experiment has never occurred. It is a hoax, plain and simple. The Navy has pointed out that degaussing technology, the real science behind the experiment's cover story, was well understood and widely used during World War II, but it had nothing to do with invisibility or teleportation. Skeptics have methodically dismantled many aspects of the Philadelphia experiment narrative. They point out that Carlos Allende was an unreliable witness with a documented history of mental health issues and a tendency toward elaborate storytelling. Allende himself later recanted his claims in interviews, saying he had made the whole thing up, though he subsequently recanted his recantation, creating a confusing tangle of contradictory statements. Research into the alleged crew members Allende named has proven problematic. Some of the names don't appear in naval records at all. Others were real sailors, but their service records show they were stationed elsewhere in 1943, nowhere near Philadelphia. No death certificates, medical records, or pension files have been found that would corroborate the catastrophic casualties the experiment allegedly produced. The physics of the supposed experiment also presents serious problems. Modern physicists who have analyzed the theoretical basis for electromagnetic invisibility point out that the technology described couldn't possibly work as claimed. Bending light around an object requires materials and techniques that didn't exist in 1943 and barely exist now. The energy requirements would be astronomical, far beyond what a destroyer's generators could produce. And the idea that such a field could cause teleportation is, according to current scientific understanding, simply impossible. However, proponents of the Philadelphia experiment have their own evidence and arguments. They point out that highly classified military projects by their nature leave little paper trail. The Manhattan Project, which definitely happened and employed tens of thousands of people, was kept secret for years. If the Navy wanted to hide an experiment, they could certainly falsify deck logs and reassign crew members. Some researchers have uncovered intriguing anomalies in the official records. The USS Eldridge's crew roster shows unusual patterns of transfers and discharges in late 1943 and early 1944, more than would be typical for a newly commissioned ship. Several crew members were medically discharged with vague diagnoses like nervous exhaustion or schizophrenia, conditions that would be consistent with the psychological trauma the experiment allegedly caused. There's also the curious case of the ship's commissioning and early service. The Eldridge was commissioned in August 1943 but didn't depart on her first combat mission until November, an unusually long delay for a wartime vessel when every ship was desperately needed. What was the ship doing during those months? The official records say training and fitting out, but skeptics of the skeptics ask, couldn't that gap have accommodated an experimental project? Several elderly men have come forward over the years claiming to be survivors of the Philadelphia experiment. The most famous was Alfred Bielek, who in the 1980s began giving lectures about his alleged experiences aboard the Eldridge. Bielek claimed he and his brother had been crew members, had been teleported to the future during the experiment, and had their memories suppressed by the Navy. His account was detailed and consistent, though critics noted that Bielek only came forward decades after the alleged event and couldn't provide any documentation of his naval service. Another alleged survivor was Edward Cameron, who claimed to remember jumping off the Eldridge during the experiment and time-traveling to the future. Like Bielek, Cameron's story was elaborate but unverifiable. Skeptics point out that both men's accounts closely followed the narrative established by Carlos Allende's letters and books published about the experiment, suggesting they might have been embellishing or fabricating based on existing stories rather than providing independent testimony. The scientific community has remained largely dismissive of the Philadelphia experiment, but some have noted that the theoretical physics behind parts of the story aren't entirely impossible, just extremely improbable with 1940s technology. Einstein did work on unified field theory, though there's no evidence he applied it to military projects. The concept of using electromagnetic fields to affect visibility or radar detection has been explored in stealth technology, though through different methods than the experiment described. Interestingly, decades after the alleged experiment, the U.S. military did develop actual invisibility technology, though nothing like the Philadelphia experiment. Modern stealth aircraft like the F-117 and B-2 bomber use radar-absorbent materials and carefully designed shapes to minimize their radar signature. The Philadelphia experiment, if it happened, might have been an early, catastrophically failed attempt at a similar goal. One of the most compelling aspects of the Philadelphia experiment legend is its persistence. Despite official denials, lack of hard evidence, and the debunking of specific claims, the story hasn't died. It's been the subject of books, movies, documentaries, and countless internet discussions. Why? Perhaps because it taps into deep-seated anxieties about government secrecy, the dangers of unchecked scientific experimentation, and the human cost of military ambition. Whether the Philadelphia experiment happened as described, happened in some modified form, or never happened at all, it represents something real, the fear of what might occur when science and warfare combine without adequate consideration of the consequences. Chapter 6: The Legacy and the Questions That Remain. More than 8 decades after the alleged Philadelphia experiment, the story refuses to disappear. It has become woven into the fabric of American conspiracy lore, sitting alongside Roswell, Area 51, and MKUltra, projects that either definitely happened or remain the subject of enduring speculation. But unlike pure conspiracy theories, the Philadelphia experiment raises legitimate questions about the nature of classified military research and the price of scientific ambition during wartime. Let's consider what we know for certain about World War II-era scientific experimentation. The era was characterized by unprecedented pushes into unknown scientific territory, often with limited understanding of the consequences. The Manhattan Project developed atomic weapons that opened the nuclear age, with long-term effects from radiation exposure that weren't fully understood until decades later. Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists to America, some of whom had conducted horrific human experiments. The Tuskegee syphilis study, which ran from 1932 to 1972, deliberately denied treatment to black men to study the disease's progression. These aren't conspiracy theories, these are documented historical facts. Given this context, is it really so implausible that the Navy might have conducted an experimental project with insufficient safety considerations? The military's track record includes numerous examples of service members being exposed to dangerous conditions in the name of research. During the Cold War, soldiers were deliberately exposed to nuclear fallout during atmospheric tests. Sailors were ordered to scrub the decks of ships that had passed through atomic blast zones, absorbing radiation. If the Navy was willing to expose personnel to known dangers, might they have also conducted experiments with unknown risks? The technological timing is also suggestive. The 1940s saw revolutionary advances in electromagnetic theory and application. Radar was being rapidly developed and deployed. The Manhattan Project was exploring atomic energy. Scientists were pushing boundaries across every field. The idea that some researchers might have attempted to apply unified field theory to military purposes, even if ultimately unsuccessful or catastrophic, fits the pattern of wartime innovation and risk-taking. What makes the Philadelphia experiment particularly haunting is how it fits into a broader pattern of alleged black projects, highly classified military research that operates beyond public oversight or traditional ethical boundaries. We know such projects existed during World War II and the Cold War. The question isn't whether the military conducted secret experiments, but which experiments actually happened and which are myths. The USS Eldridge herself had an unremarkable naval career after 1943. She served in convoy escort duties throughout the Atlantic and Mediterranean, earning no particular distinction. After World War II ended, she was transferred to the Greek Navy in 1951 and renamed HS Leon. She served Greece for nearly 40 years before being decommissioned in 1992 and scrapped in 1999. If the ship held any secrets, they were dismantled and melted down with her steel. But the human legacy remains. Assuming the experiment happened as described, what became of the survivors? The men who were driven insane or experienced spontaneous invisibility would now all be long dead, their suffering ended. But what about the families who never learned the truth? The parents who were told their sons died in action when they might have been killed in an experiment. The wives who watched their husbands return from the war fundamentally changed, psychologically broken in ways that couldn't be explained. The Philadelphia experiment raises profound ethical questions about informed consent in military service. Service members in wartime operate under orders and have limited ability to refuse assignments. If the Navy did conduct such an experiment, did the crew know what they were volunteering for? Were they even told it was experimental? The Nuremberg Code, which established ethical guidelines for human experimentation, wasn't formally adopted until 1947, after the alleged Philadelphia experiment. The 1940s military operated under different rules, or perhaps no rules at all when it came to experimenting on its own personnel. There's also the question of what such an experiment, if successful, might have meant for the war effort in human history. Imagine if the Navy had achieved even partial success, ships that could evade radar, vessels that could appear and disappear. The Battle of the Atlantic might have turned in the Allies' favor months or years earlier. D-Day could have been even more successful with invisible transport ships. The atomic bombs might never have been necessary if the Navy could have deployed invisible ships along Japanese coasts. The entire trajectory of World War II and the subsequent Cold War could have been different. But perhaps the catastrophic failure, if that's what occurred, taught an equally important lesson. Maybe the Philadelphia experiment, whether real or legendary, represents a boundary that shouldn't be crossed, a warning about the dangers of pushing too hard, too fast into unknown scientific territory without fully understanding the consequences. The horrific fate of the crew in the story serves as a cautionary tale about the price of unchecked ambition. Today, the Navy continues to research stealth and invisibility technologies, but through incremental, carefully controlled development. Modern stealth ships like the USS Sumwalt use radar-absorbent materials, angled surfaces, and electronic countermeasures, not electromagnetic fields that might tear apart space-time. The lesson, if there is one, seems to have been learned: some shortcuts are too dangerous to attempt. The truth about the Philadelphia experiment may never be definitively known. The official records deny it happened. The evidence is circumstantial and contradictory. The witnesses are unreliable or dead. But the story persists because it speaks to something deeper than historical fact. It represents our anxieties about government secrecy, military power, and the potential for science to create horrors along with miracles. Perhaps the most honest answer to the question, did the Philadelphia experiment really happen, is this: something happened in October 1943, something related to the USS Eldridge and electromagnetic research, something that was classified and has been obscured by decades of secrecy, myth-making, and deliberate misdirection. Whether that something was as dramatic as claimed, or something more mundane that grew in the retelling, we may never know. What we can know is this: the Philadelphia experiment represents a ghost ship in more than one sense. It's a vessel that may have briefly slipped between reality and legend, carrying a crew whose fate was sealed the moment they stepped aboard. Whether they vanished into electromagnetic oblivion or simply disappeared into classified files and forgotten records, they remain lost to history, a reminder of the human cost of war, science, and the pursuit of impossible weapons. The USS Eldridge is gone, scrapped decades ago. Carlos Allende is dead, his testimony forever uncertain. The alleged crew members have all passed away. The scientists who might have designed the experiment are long deceased. And yet, the story lives on, a ghost ship sailing through the waters of conspiracy and history, never quite solid enough to be proven real, never quite transparent enough to be fully dismissed. In the end, perhaps that's fitting. The Philadelphia experiment remains as invisible to historical certainty as the ship allegedly became on that October day in 1943, present in our imagination, absent from our evidence, forever sailing in the fog between truth and legend. So what do you think? Did the U.S. Navy really conduct an experiment that tore apart space-time and drove men insane? Or is the Philadelphia experiment nothing more than a ghost story, a myth born from wartime secrecy and one man's letters? Drop your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dive into one of World War II's darkest mysteries, make sure you're subscribed for more forgotten history and unexplained events from the war. Hit that like button, share this with anyone who loves military mysteries, and check out our other videos on secret weapons and classified projects from the 1940s. The truth is out there, somewhere between the official denials and the conspiracy theories. We'll keep searching for it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.